Chapter 1: The Inheritance. Megan Clark stood at the foot of her grandmother's old Victorian house, the wind whispering through the skeletal trees that lined the gravel path. The letter from the lawyer still crumpled in her hand. She stared at the darkened windows, feeling an unease settle in her chest. This house, filled with the remnants of her grandmother's life, was now hers. She had not visited in over a decade, not since she was a child. Her memories of the house were faint: warm embraces, the scent of lavender tea, and the way the wooden floors always seemed to creak beneath her small feet. But there was something else, something shadowy lurking in the depths of her recollection. A whisper of fear she could not quite place. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The brass handle was cold to the touch, an odd chill running through her as she twisted it open. The house creaked in protest, as if reluctant to let her in. She stepped into the foyer, the smell of dust and old wood greeting her. But beneath it lay something sour, something that made her stomach twist. The house was eerily silent, yet Megan could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, an almost palpable presence. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if the house had been waiting for her, silent, patient, but somehow watching. The walls of the foyer were lined with faded wallpaper, the once vibrant floral pattern now muted by age. The staircase, grand and sweeping, rose in front of her, its dark banister gleaming faintly in the dim light that filtered through the stained glass window above. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the space as though expecting something to move, some shadow to take form in the corner of her vision. But there was nothing. The house was still. She let out a shaky breath, her hand gripping the letter tighter. Her grandmother's will had been straightforward. The house was to be passed down to her, as the only living relative. But that was all it said. No mention of the memories that clung to the house. No mention of the strange occurrences that Megan had once dismissed as childish imagination. As a young girl, she had loved visiting her grandmother. But after a few unsettling experiences, she had started to dread the long weekends spent here. And then, when her grandmother had passed away, the house had been left untouched, shrouded in mystery. Megan had never once thought to visit again. Until now. Her steps echoed through the house as she made her way further inside, passing the parlor where the heavy curtains remained drawn, blocking out the sun's pale rays. The furniture was unchanged, each piece carefully preserved, as if her grandmother might return at any moment to resume her usual routine. The air felt stale, thick with years of abandonment, yet there was something more, something sinister that clung to the room like a second skin. She walked through the parlor, her eyes briefly catching the reflection of herself in the tall mirror above the fireplace. Her face looked pale, drawn, her eyes wide and unsettled. She quickly turned away and continued onward, her footsteps slow and deliberate. A hallway stretched out before her, leading to rooms she had long forgotten. She could not shake the feeling that something was off, that the house, though empty, was not quite abandoned. Every room she passed seemed to hold a secret, a hidden memory waiting to be uncovered. Megan's fingers brushed against the dark wood of the grand staircase, the surface smooth but cold to the touch. The air grew thicker as she ascended, the silence growing more oppressive with each step. She reached the top, her hand hovering over the banister, unsure of what to do next. She could hear nothing. No creaks from the old house, no scurrying of mice, no distant hum of life. The second floor stretched before her, its shadowy hallways like tunnels leading into the unknown. Her grandmother had always insisted that she stay away from the rooms at the end of the hall, the ones with the locked doors. Megan had never asked why, but she knew deep down, there had been something forbidden in that part of the house. Something that made her grandmother nervous. It was that nervousness, that subtle sense of dread, that had clung to the place during her childhood visits. But now, Megan was here, and she was determined to face whatever lay within. She walked down the hall toward the door at the end, the wooden floors groaning beneath her as if protesting her decision. Her pulse quickened, and she found herself drawn to the very place her grandmother had forbidden her to go. The door at the end of the hall was heavy dark wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to swirl into patterns that were almost hypnotic. Megan had never seen the inside of this room, never known what secrets it kept hidden behind the thick door. And yet she could not resist. Her hand reached out and grasped the cold brass handle. She twisted it slowly, the faint click of the lock echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. A single window on the far wall was covered with a heavy drape, blocking the sunlight completely. The room was filled with dust, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as though to protect it from the ravages of time. Megan stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. It felt wrong. This room felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, a pressure that weighed on her chest. As she moved further in, she noticed something strange. A low hum, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was a faint vibration, as if the house itself was alive, resonating with some hidden force. She shuddered, her fingers brushing against the sheet covering the small chest in the corner of the room. The chest was old, with brass hinges that had turned green with age. Something about it drew her in, and she knew, without knowing why, that it held the key to the mystery that had plagued her memories. Her fingers hovered over the lock, but before she could touch it, a sudden sound broke the silence. It was a whisper, faint but clear, as if someone or something was calling her name. Megan! She froze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It was soft, like a whisper on the wind, but it had an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no one there. The room remained empty, just as it had been when she entered. But the whisper came again, closer this time. Megan! Her breath hitched in her throat, and she took a step backward, her hand tightening around the letter still crumpled in her palm. She had to leave. She had to get out of this house, out of this room, before it consumed her. But her feet wouldn't move. The floor felt like it was rooted to the ground, pulling her deeper into the room, deeper into the mystery that had haunted her dreams for years. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, until they filled her ears, drowning out everything else. And then just as quickly they stopped. Silence. But Megan could feel it, the presence, the weight, the lingering fear. She wasn't alone. Her eyes darted toward the chest again, and without thinking, her hand moved toward it. The lock clicked open, as if it had been waiting for her. She lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking as they revealed what lay inside. A single piece of paper, yellowed with age, lay at the bottom of the chest. Megan reached for it, her fingers trembling. As she unfolded the paper, a single sentence was scrawled in elegant handwriting. "The house will never let you go." A chill ran down Megan's spine as the words burned into her mind. The house, her grandmother's house, was not just a place. It was a force. And it was waiting for her. Chapter 2: The First Room. Determined to shake the fear gripping her, Megan climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the polished wooden railing. Each step felt heavier than the last. The house, darkened with age and secrets, creaked around her like an old man stretching, his bones groaning under the weight of forgotten memories. She swallowed her rising unease and focused on the task at hand. Find out what had happened here, to her family, to her grandmother, to the house itself. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated for a moment, staring down the narrow corridor. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of ancestors, their faces obscured by time, staring down at her with hollow eyes. Megan turned away, unwilling to face the silent judgment of generations. She knew that she had to move forward. Her hand, trembling but determined, rested on the brass doorknob of the first room on the left. It was a room she vaguely remembered, her grandmother's reading room, the place where the old woman had spent countless hours, surrounded by books, sipping tea and muttering softly to herself. Megan had always thought the room was a sanctuary, a quiet space to escape the world outside. But now it seemed like the entrance to something far darker, a threshold to a place where the past still lingered, pressing its cold fingers against her mind. The door creaked open, and a chill rushed in to greet her. The room, despite being empty, felt alive in a way that Megan couldn't quite explain. The air was thick with the weight of history, stale, old, and heavy. The scent of dust mingled with something else, something metallic, as though the room had not been disturbed for decades. Megan stepped inside, her shoes tapping softly against the hardwood floor, and her eyes roamed the familiar but eerie sight before her. Bookshelves stretched up to the ceiling, filled with volumes in varying states of disrepair. Leather-bound covers, their gold embossing faded, were nestled between fragile paperbacks and yellowed, brittle pages. A plush armchair sat near the fireplace, its fabric dark and worn from years of use, though it still looked inviting in a way. The light of the fireplace flickered and danced, casting shadows across the room in an almost hypnotic way, its warmth surprisingly absent. Megan glanced at the small writing desk tucked into the corner, its surface cluttered with old pens, paperweights, and stacks of letters tied with string. A single lamp stood beside it, its brass base tarnished with age. The light from the fire flickered against the desk's surface, and Megan found herself drawn toward it, despite her rising dread. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, the crackling of the fireplace. Megan flinched as the flames flared to life on their own, leaping higher into the chimney. She could have sworn she had not seen the fire when she entered. Her breath caught in her throat. The room was changing. The air was growing colder, and with it, the whispers began. A low guttural sound at the edge of her hearing, like voices barely audible, murmuring through the cracks in the walls. She shook her head, trying to push the sensation away. As she looked down, her gaze caught something unusual on the floor beneath the armchair. A dark, almost black stain spread across the polished wood. It was large, far too large to be a mere spill of ink or tea. It had soaked deep into the grain of the wood, creating an ominous, almost unnatural contrast to the otherwise pristine surroundings. Megan took a step closer, her heart hammering in her chest. The stain wasn't just a stain. It was a memory, one that surged through her, unbidden and unrelenting. She saw a woman, older but unmistakably familiar, sitting in the armchair. The woman's face was contorted in terror, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched at her throat as if choking on something unseen. Her mouth gaped open in a silent scream, but no sound came. The image burned into Megan's mind. It was her grandmother. Megan's breath caught as she tried to move, but she was frozen, as if trapped in the vision. The air felt suffocating now, the very walls closing in around her. The room seemed to pulse with energy, a force she could not explain. The crackling fire seemed to grow louder, and Megan could feel her pulse quicken, her chest tightening in panic. Then, as quickly as it came, the vision disappeared. The room returned to its stillness, the fire crackling quietly in the hearth. Megan gasped for air, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support as she fought to steady herself. But the room wasn't silent. The whispers had grown louder. They no longer sounded like distant murmurs. They were voices now, close and clear, reverberating through the space. "You should not have come back." The voice was cold, malevolent, and filled with an unspoken warning. Megan's heart dropped into her stomach. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The room was empty. No one was there. But the voices were. The whispers were relentless now, swirling around her, filling her ears with a chorus of fragmented sentences and incoherent words. They felt like they were inside her head, trying to push their way out. Desperately, she clamped her hands over her ears, but it did no good. The sound only grew louder, more insistent. "Leave," came the voice again, sharper this time, accompanied by a low growl. "You cannot stay here." Her breathing turned ragged as the shadows in the room seemed to shift, as though something unseen was moving just beyond her sight. The fire flickered again, casting an eerie glow across the stain on the floor. which seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. Megan took a step backward, her legs shaking beneath her. The air was thick now, suffocating. She couldn't take it anymore. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, it was too much. She spun around and fled from the room, slamming the door behind her with a force she didn't know she had. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she pressed her back against the door, fighting to steady herself. She could feel her pulse pounding in her neck, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. What had she just seen? Was it a memory? A ghostly echo of the past? And if so, whose past did this house hold? Megan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the vision, of the whispers, of the room. But there were no answers, only more questions. She had felt it, the presence, the weight of something darker that lingered in that room. And it was clear to her now that the house had no intention of letting her leave it untouched. Her grandmother had always been secretive, never speaking of the past beyond a few cryptic words. But Megan had always assumed it was simply the quiet, unspoken burden of old age. Now, standing in the hall with the door to the reading room firmly shut behind her, she wondered just how much of that secrecy had been a shield, protecting her from something far worse than she could ever have imagined. The house, it seemed, had memories of its own, and it wasn't about to let her forget them. Chapter 3: The Locked Door. Over the next few days, Megan found herself wandering the house more and more, her curiosity growing with each unsettling discovery. The house was vast, and every room seemed to hold its own dark secrets. The smell of dust and old wood lingered in the air, a constant reminder that the place had been abandoned for years. But it was the other smells, distant, faint, but unmistakable, that haunted her most. There was a faint metallic tang like rusted iron that she couldn't quite place. And at night, the air would grow thick, almost suffocating, as if the house was holding its breath. One evening, while walking through a hallway she hadn't dared venture down before, she stumbled upon a child's bedroom. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a space that seemed frozen in time. The bed was neatly made, but the room was suffused with an eerie, lingering presence. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the small wooden rocking chair in the corner swayed back and forth, though there was no breeze to explain its movement. As Megan stood in the doorway, she heard it, the faintest sound, like the softest sobbing, as if someone was crying just beyond her reach. Her heart lurched in her chest, and she took a hesitant step into the room. The crying grew louder, but as she looked around, she saw no one. Only shadows clung to the corners of the room, long and twisted, stretching across the floor. The crying sounded as though it was coming from the walls themselves, like the house was weeping for some lost child. She closed the door with a shudder and hurried down the hall. She told herself it was just the wind, but a gnawing feeling of dread settled in her gut. She could feel the house watching her. The next day, she entered the dining room and found herself stopped cold in her tracks. The once grand table had fallen into disrepair, its surface marred by dark stains, the wood warped with age. But it wasn't the condition of the table that caught her attention. It was the blood, a large dark pool of it, spreading across the center of the table, as if someone had been murdered right there. But as Megan stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. The blood seemed to shimmer, to pulse, as if it were alive. She reached out with a trembling hand, but before she could touch it, the pool disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only an ordinary wooden table behind. Megan stumbled back, her heart racing. What was happening in this house? Despite the terror growing inside her, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: the door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others. While all the doors in the house had aged and weathered over time, this one was intact. Its wood was dark and smooth, its brass handle gleaming with an unsettling luster. It stood there, silent and foreboding, as if daring her to open it. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound, but the house was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. No creaks or whispers, just a heavy silence. Determined to uncover what lay behind the door, Megan searched the house for a key. She scoured the attic, combed through the library, and even rifled through drawers in the kitchen. But it was only when she found herself in her grandmother's room that she stumbled upon something that could help. The room, once beautifully furnished, was now a forgotten space. Dust covered everything, and the bed was untouched, the blankets still folded neatly. It was in a small, tarnished jewelry box tucked away in the corner of the dresser that she found the key. The box was old, its surface worn with age, and its clasp was cold to the touch. Inside, amongst delicate brooches, rings, and faded strands of pearls, the key lay. It was small, unadorned, but it radiated an odd energy, almost as though it had been waiting for her. With trembling fingers, she closed the box and clutched the key in her hand. She hurried back down the hallway to the locked door. The moment she inserted the key into the lock, there was a loud click, and the door creaked open, as though the house itself were sighing in relief. Megan stepped inside. The room beyond was dimly lit, its only light coming from the flickering of an old, broken lamp in the corner. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of something ancient and long forgotten clung to the walls. Her gaze immediately fell upon the walls, which were covered in yellowed photographs. Each one was a faded black and white image, capturing faces that seemed both familiar and foreign. There were faces of people she didn't recognize, strangers who appeared to have lived here long ago. But there were others, faces she knew all too well, her ancestors staring back at her with blank, hollow eyes. Some of them smiled, but there was something unnerving about their expressions. It was as though they were all hiding something, something unspeakable. But it was the eyes that unsettled her the most. They were cold, lifeless, as though the souls behind them had been drained, leaving only empty shells. Fear, an overwhelming, unshakable fear, seemed to emanate from every photograph. In the center of the room, a wooden chest sat on the floor, its lid slightly ajar. Megan approached it cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to know what secrets it held. She slowly lifted the lid, the sound of the hinges creaking filling the otherwise silent room. Inside, the chest was lined with old journals, faded letters tied with fraying ribbons, and a small ornate mirror. Her fingers hovered over the items, but it was the mirror that caught her attention. The frame was intricately designed, carved with patterns that seemed almost alive. When she picked it up, a shiver ran down her spine. The coldness of the glass seemed to seep into her bones, and for a brief moment, she felt a strange pull, an unexplainable compulsion to look deeper into it. As she gazed into the mirror, her reflection stared back at her. At least, she thought it was her. But then something shifted. Her features blurred, and the face that stared back at her was no longer her own. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Her lips twisted into a sinister grin, as if mocking Megan's fear. Megan gasped, stumbling back. Her heart raced, and the air around her grew thick, oppressive. The woman's grin widened, stretching unnaturally. "It's your turn now," the woman whispered, her voice a low, chilling hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the mirror, its shattering echo ringing through the room. She backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. But the woman's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, followed her every movement. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The walls closed in. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. And for the first time, Megan realized with a sickening certainty that she was not alone. The house had been waiting for her. Chapter 4. The Truth Revealed. Panic surged through Megan's chest as the cold, delicate glass of the mirror slipped from her hands and shattered onto the floor, sending shards scattering across the room. She gasped for air, her breath shallow and ragged. The once quiet house now hummed with an eerie, low murmur. At first, it was so faint that she thought it was her imagination, a lingering echo of fear and confusion. But soon the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It seemed to come from all directions, wrapping around her like a thick fog. She's here, she's here. The voices murmured, indistinguishable but all too clear in their urgency. Megan stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she had to leave. This was madness, pure madness. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the very air thick and heavy, pressing against her lungs, making it hard to breathe. But before she could make a move toward the door, something in the room caught her eye. The journals. They were stacked haphazardly on the desk by the window, some of them old, their covers worn and frayed. Megan's fingers shook as she reached for the nearest one. The moment her fingers touched the leather-bound cover, a sharp chill ran up her spine, and the whispering intensified, wrapping around her, drowning her thoughts. She forced herself to open the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible. She skimmed quickly, desperate for answers, her eyes darting over the sentences as they began to reveal a chilling history. Passed down from one generation to the next, the curse of the Clark family cannot be undone. It is tied to the land itself, to the house that has stood for centuries. It feeds on the souls of the innocent, drawing them in with promises of safety and warmth. But once inside, there is no escape. Each heir is claimed, and the cycle continues. Megan's hands froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had barely read a few lines before her mind reeled in disbelief. The curse. It was real. All the stories the townspeople whispered about the Clark family, the unexplained deaths, the disappearances, the rumors of strange happenings around the house, had been true. Tears streamed down her face as she read on. The journal detailed the fates of those who had lived here before her. Each one had fallen victim to the curse. The house had devoured them, their souls trapped within its walls, forced to relive their torment over and over. And now she had inherited it all. She had inherited not just the house, but the curse as well. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She thought of the woman in the mirror, the reflection that had smiled back at her with a knowing, malevolent grin. The very same woman whose image had now become a nightmare, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had seen her before, hadn't she? Years ago as a child. Her mother had spoken of the woman, warning her of the danger lurking in the shadows of the house. But Megan had dismissed it as just a story, a tale spun to keep her safe. The room began to spin and Megan's vision blurred. She gripped the journal tighter, hoping to anchor herself to some semblance of reality. But the whispers were growing louder, more insistent now, the voices warping into one, a collective chant. She is the heir, she must claim what is hers. Megan felt a cold presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The woman. The one from the mirror. Her presence was suffocating, dark and cold, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. With a trembling hand, Megan reached out for the next journal, flipping it open to another page. This one was filled with scrawled notes, written in what appeared to be a frantic, hurried hand. She watches. She waits. She will not rest until she has her due. Each heir must face the mirror. She will claim them, body and soul. Megan's heart skipped a beat. The mirror. She had to face the mirror. The thought sent a wave of terror through her, her pulse racing. The woman in the glass. She wasn't just a figment of imagination. She was real, and she had been waiting for Megan all along. The air in the room thickened, and shadows in the corners of the room deepened. Megan's pulse thudded in her ears as the woman stepped forward from the depths of the darkness. Her long flowing hair swirled around her like a dark halo, her pale hollow face framed by it. Her eyes locked onto Megan's, their depths swirling with an ancient hunger. She smiled again, the same twisted, unnerving grin from the mirror, and this time Megan could see it clearly. Her teeth were sharp, unnaturally so, like those of a predator. Megan backed away, her body trembling, but the woman's presence seemed to close in on her, her every step like a cold breeze that carried with it the stench of death. "You cannot escape, Megan," the woman whispered, her voice like silk, smooth and mocking. This house is yours now. You are part of it, bound to it just as I am. You will never leave. A scream caught in Megan's throat, but it was swallowed by the air, as if the house itself had claimed it. The woman's laugh echoed in her ears, growing louder, more insistent. The walls felt as if they were closing in on her, and the shadows moved, stretching like tendrils to ensnare her. Megan's knees buckled and she fell to the floor. Her breath was ragged, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the terror she felt. She reached out for the mirror, her hand trembling as she tried to grasp the surface, to hold on to some piece of reality. And then the room spun. The shadows twisted into shapes, their forms becoming more and more grotesque, as if they were alive, reaching for her. The woman's figure loomed closer, her face now inches from Megan's. "Join me," the woman said softly, her voice now a seductive, almost pleading whisper. "You are mine now. You always were." Megan opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The walls groaned, the air suffocating her. And then silence. When the townspeople found the house months later, it was eerily quiet. The front door stood ajar, but there was no sign of life inside. The furniture remained untouched. The dust had settled over everything, a heavy blanket of time that seemed to have swallowed the past. The walls, once filled with the sound of whispers, were still. The townspeople searched the house, but Megan Clark was nowhere to be found. They whispered among themselves, of course, speaking in hushed tones about the cursed house and the family that had vanished. But no one dared to venture inside. Not after what had happened to the last few who tried. And deep within the walls of the house, the whispering returned, faint at first, then growing stronger. It echoed from every corner, every crack and every hidden place. It was a promise, a warning. The house was waiting. It always was. And someday it would call again, ready to claim its next heir.